The Reading Rockets teleconference series is a production of WETA. This program is made possible by the generous support of Scholastic, the world's largest publisher and distributor of children's books and a leader in educational technology. Major funding for Reading Rockets comes from the United States Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. Our partners for this program include the American Speech Language Hearing Association, the National Head Start Association, Parents Action for Children, and the National Association of State Directors of Special Education.
Hello, I'm Delia Pompa. Welcome to this year's second teleconference in the Reading Rocket series, Achieving Success in Reading. Today we're going to look at how what happens before children enter school affects their ability to learn to read. Here to help us are three of the nation's leading experts in early childhood education. Dr. Todd Risley is the co-author of the seminal research study, Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experience of Young American Children. He is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Alaska. Dr. Sharon Ramey is co-director for the Center on Health and Education at Georgetown University. And Dr. Julie Washington is a professor in the Department of Audiology and Speech-Language Pathology at Wayne State University. We would also like to welcome our audience of parents, teachers, and professionals who care deeply about improving the lives of children. Later on in the show, we'll be taking some of their questions. We'll start with Dr. Risley. Dr. Risley, you and your colleague, Dr. Betty Hart, produced a study that documented the types of daily interactions parents have with young children. In a nutshell, what did you learn?
What we learned was that before the child is 3, remember the child is awake about 100 hours a week. That's a learning opportunity time. The question is what experience, how is that time filled up or is it empty? What we learned was the incredible differences between families in amount of talking that parents did with their babies. For example, the average child by the age of 3 has heard 20 million words addressed to them. Okay, children of very talkative, socially interactive families have heard 35 million words addressed to them by the age of 3. Children of very taciturn and non-responsive families have heard less than 10 million words addressed to them. This plays out in the child's vocabulary size. So the average child has about a 700 word vocabulary by the age of 3. Children of very sociable, interactive families have a vocabulary of about 1,100 words. Children of very taciturn, non-reactive families, responsive families, have only about a 500 word vocabulary. Those differences before age 3, we're talking about babies before age 3, in the kind of the bosom of their families in the home, 15,000 hours of experience is about to be filled up or empty, and that difference is extraordinarily great and extraordinarily important way before we even start talking about reading.
So the amount of talking that happens at home matters, but what about the quality? Does it matter what we're talking to kids about?
That's another discovery we found, and that is the more you talk, the higher the quality of what you say. Everybody says a certain amount of business talk. Stop that, get down from there, don't do that. The things to get something done, everybody does that, whether they only talk a little or talk a lot. But if you only talk a little, that's all you're saying. When you're talking a lot, all the complexity, everything else, it's about something else. It's chit-chat, it's gossip, it's commentary. All the richness is in the extra talk. So the message is, don't worry, talk a lot, it will automatically be rich. It'll be positive and rich because it's not about business.
So hanging around while my mom gossiped was a good thing.
That's right.
What factors contribute to a richer language environment?
Well, it really is the amount of talking and dancing the parent is doing with the baby is the richer environment. with young babies, the important part of their world is their caregiver, is the interaction of the adult who has to take care of them, who has to be there to protect and nurture it. And so the amount of dancing that adult is doing with the baby is the richer environment automatically. That's the focus, is to say, with babies. Now, when older kids, you're talking about content, you're talking about more important things to teach children. But with babies, it's all about the everyday experiences that are in front of babies all the time. And it's whether you add words to those experiences in interaction with the baby or not. That's the simple message. You don't have to worry about how to talk to your baby. Just talk a lot.
Thanks, Dr. Risley. Let's take a look at a preschool in Silver Spring, Maryland, where caregivers use everyday conversation to improve children's oral language skills.
I think Tyree picked out this book. Did you pick out this book?
No.
Who picked the book?
At a Maryland daycare center, 2- and 3-year-olds are engaged in conversation by caregiver Daphne Jones.
What kind of truck is that?
Go-kart.
A go-kart truck. Have you ever been on a go-kart truck?
Go up and down.
Up and down. That's what the truck did. The truck went up and down.
Dr. Deborah Gervais Pendergrass is co-director of this project called Stories.
We believe that every child, regardless of age, gender, ethnicity, disability, has a story to tell.
When adults respond to a toddler's efforts to communicate, they help the development of spoken language. Gervais Pendergrass has identified 15 specific cues that adults can watch for.
It may be a word combinations, a sentence or a series of sentences put together, a gesture, it's a facial expression, a cry. Zoe is saying, ow! Something happened.
Gervais Pendergrass videotapes the kids. To train caregivers, she picks out good examples when adults tune into a child or instructive cases when they miss an opportunity to connect.
And then we have Amber who's saying, Daphne, we got stuck.
Daphne, we got.
Meaning we got stuck again, but she's using a 2-word combination to communicate that story.
By opening our eyes to young kids' efforts to communicate, Gervais Pendergrass hopes to increase conversation, boost vocabulary, and propel toddlers toward literacy.
With young children, things that we take for granted, for them, are important stories and important experiences to share. Language is free. It's a gift that we can give our children anytime and any place. The only thing that it costs us is our time.
So, Dr. Risley, we just saw 3-year-olds who are learning to use language. At what age do children first start paying attention to the words they hear?
From the very beginning. There isn't any magical time. What we see is talkative parents are adding words, talking as much to infants, newborn babies, as they are to toddlers. They're talking a lot, or they're very talking a little. It doesn't change with the baby as the baby gets old. So talking, as far as we know, has an impact from the very beginning. Words, adding words to experience, adding words, whether it's, whether you know the full meaning of the word, you're adding and associating words with everything that's going on, the child's looking at and attending to, and filling the child's life up in addition to what they're seeing with words and language seems to be the important variable.
Babies hear prenatally. If you sing a song or say a poem, when your baby's born, they'll recognize the cadence and the rhythm and the sound. So babies are tuned in really early, even before birth.
For those of us who like sports, one of the metaphors that I like to use with parents is that talking to your baby is like color commentary in a football game. Just talk, narrate, talk about what you're doing, talk about what you see, talk about what's going on. It may seem odd to people who are watching when you're standing in the kitchen saying, I think I'll cook an omelet. I'm not sure whether I want mushrooms in it or whether I want peppers in it. But to the baby, it's all talk, and it's all engagement, and it's all listening and learning, and contributes to later language development.
Dr. Ramey, is there a difference between what babies learn about when they're spoken to as opposed to what they learn from observing language as it's spoken around them?
Well, for a little baby, it's all through the interaction. They see your eyes light up, they watch your mouth. They learn that it is, as Dr. Risley was saying, it's a dance. They learn a great deal. In addition to vocabulary, they're learning this is a way of social interaction that can be rewarding. From a distance, like watching words on TV or listening to radio or to the stereo, when they're little, they don't learn very much from a distance.
What about you, Dr. Risley? I'm curious, what they're hearing versus how they're hearing it, does it make a difference?
No, and those are all kind of confounded, because talkative families talk to everybody talking to each other. Taciturn families only talk business to each other, to the baby. You know, they only talk simple things. And so what you see is the child who is talked to a lot is also immersed in a language culture where people are talking to each other a lot. Whereas a child who is not talked to very much is immersed in a culture where people are not talking to each other. So they're hearing it addressed at him, at the same time they're hearing it in interchange with other people, but they go together so tightly in a given family.
And part of the dance we're talking about is not just learning words, it's the nonverbal social environment around talking that children are also learning. They're learning about emotions, they're learning about the social context that goes with the words that they hear in the family and with the interactions in the family. All of that comes from listening, from being talking to, from observing. And so they're learning how to be social beings by listening to you talk.
Following up on that, how do children begin to assign meanings to words?
We talk about children assigning meaning to words through a process called fast mapping. And that is that children hear a word, they hear it in the context of an activity or in the context of an object or a person, and they map meaning onto it. And so, for example, if a child's first exposure to an animal is a dog, we all know if we have young children from that point forward, every four-legged animal with a tail and two ears is a dog. And over time, what children do is refine those definitions and differentiate so that eventually they learn that cows also have four legs, a tail, but they make a different sound and they give milk. And so they refine those definitions over time. And children who have world experience are the ones who refine the definitions. So the exposure to the cow, whether it's through a book or through the zoo, allows them to refine the definition. And so when we're teaching children the sounds that animals make, it's not just a game. It is the process of refinement for a young child. And play is work when you're a child. And so the more you learn through interactions and through the play and book reading, you're really learning about the world in a way that adults lose track of, I think. And if you pay a lot of attention to your child, you can learn new things too as an adult by listening to them. But they map meaning onto words, and so we want to be really careful in classrooms. I like to tell teachers about asking, does anybody know what something means? And having children give the wrong definition, because there are several children in that room who are going to get that definition and hold on to it. That's what fast mapping is about. So the next class, when you come back and you talk about that issue, you're unteaching things that a few children in the room learned because somebody said a dog was something that it wasn't. And so rather than unteaching those things, it makes more sense for the teacher to put those definitions forward in the beginning, what you want them to learn, allow them to map onto it, and then expand it from there.
Your colleagues had enthusiastic nods here. Dr. Ramey, would you like to add something to that?
Well, children, when you said play is work, I want to be sure it's the good kind of work. It's the kind of work you want to get up and go to. Children love words. Words, they're actually sensuous. They like the feeling inside their mouth of their tongue moving and making new sounds. Children can often pronounce words that are difficult for us.
That's right.
As adults, it's quite amazing. They like multi-syllable words. So people often underestimate, because they're so little and aren't worldly yet, and only teach them simplistic words, but try giving a toddler or a young child a great big huge word and let them get their hands and heads and mouths around that word. They just adore learning language.
Dr. Risley, what about parents who, the taciturn families that don't talk? What can we do to help them understand and to do?
To get examples and the message out. We don't need to confuse them by saying you got to talk differently to your child. We need to say it's a matter of talking more, and you know how. Every parent, even the most taciturn parent at the time they were upbeat and feeling good and something, were talking a lot to their child, and their language was complex and had all the good things to it too. So it's a matter of getting across to people who have grown up in taciturn families themselves, who have never seen people chit-chat and play and comment and gossip and comment aloud to their baby. That, in a sense, it's something that's alien to some family, some culture, some subcultures. And it's a matter of, we need to get that message out that don't worry about what it is you're saying. Talk a lot, because automatically it will be good if you talk more than just business. The problem, of course, is that in a family microculture that's very taciturn, it's only business that people talk to each other. When the children themselves come to talk, they have a very low vocabulary, and they don't talk very much either, because they only talk about business too, about getting something done. But it's the message of getting it, saying, don't worry about content, talk a lot. This is to babies. Now, we need to worry about content later on when we're talking about schools and teaching. But with babies, just talking will automatically give you the rich content.
Well, beyond taciturn families, Dr. Washington, what can we do to help parents who themselves are reluctant readers or don't have a rich vocabulary of their own?
I think I really resonate to some of the things that Dr. Risley is saying about talking, because when we're talking about reading, it's the same issue, that you want to get the message out that it is important to interact around books. Reading is not necessarily the point. Certainly with very young children, it's the interaction around the book. And it's also important, as we're getting the message out, that as professionals we're providing models for what this looks like and what we're asking parents to do. A lot of times we tell parents to read to children, and for a parent who's a reluctant reader or who doesn't have good reading skills themselves, how to do that is something that they're not quite sure about. And so modeling the interaction around the book, if you have a 30-page book and a 3-year-old child, the point is not getting through the 30 pages. The point is the book, the narrative. You can use books that don't have words, wordless picture books. It's the story, it's the interaction, it's the talking, it's being involved with the child. And I think getting that out to parents and showing them and telling them that the point really is the interaction. It's not how well you read to your child. It's not that you read the whole book. It's that you have the interaction around the book, that you tie it to things that are important in your family, and make reading a fun activity and an important activity for children. Children have to realize the value of reading, and that it's an exciting thing to do, it's a fun thing to do with your parent, it's cuddle time with mom or dad, and reading becomes something that children want to do. And that's something we're really trying to teach at these young ages before children are in school, that books are good, reading is good, and the experience is great.
I like how you all characterize it as the dance. It sounds like it is very much a dance.
Yes.
Dr. Ramey, talk about the behaviors that caregivers should adopt to help build a young child's language.
Well, we have identified 7 kinds of behaviors that parents, teachers, older siblings, anyone who loves and cares about children should adopt. And these are based on literally thousands of scientific studies. And what's really neat about these 7 learning essentials is that everyone has been linked to brain development as well as to behavioral competence, to intelligence, to happiness, to a sense of well-being. So the 7 essentials of learning.
You are going to tell us.
I'm going to tell you. The first is to encourage exploration, that the child touches the world, tastes the world, looks at the world, and as the baby gets older, you do it through talking and demonstrating, but to be open, to actively experience, not passively, to actively explore the world. The second is to mentor the child in what we call the basics. And mentoring is just teaching with love, with the well-being of the learner central to your activities. And some people say, well, what do I teach them? It's like, what words? Teach them anything that you like. Teach them anything you know. Teaching is good.
Give us an example of mentoring, because we often think of mentoring as someone who comes in from the outside and engages with the child a short period of time. Is that what you're talking about?
No, when I'm with my little baby granddaughter, I teach her up and down, and I go up, I go, it fell down. And I'm mentoring her because I'm thinking about her well-being and her ability to learn the idea of up and down. And then I might say, up and down, those are opposite. They're not the same. They're but up, and then, I mean, we might find other things that are the same. And that's, mentoring is really teaching where you care about the well-being of someone else. You're not doing it to elevate yourself. You're doing it for them. Mm-hmm. So you encourage them to explore, you mentor, and then when they learn something, you celebrate, you reinforce. Every culture celebrates walking and talking, but every day is something new to celebrate. It's not just saying you're great or you're smart. It's, oh, you did that, and linking it to the child's behavior. Then, after you celebrate the new behavior, practice time. Mm-hmm. So you rehearse, you review, you extend the new behavior, because every behavior can be used in a more sophisticated way. It's multi-purpose. So you help the children get good at what they've learned. And then in the whole process, you always think about protecting the child from inappropriate punishment and teasing and a kind of harshness that's not right for their age. So we've watched teachers and parents who deeply care about their children, and they want their children to be well behaved, and they land up punishing them or being mean to them when they're real little, and they can't understand why someone's doing that and being mad at them. I mean, a child who's crawling around is going to grab a cord, and if the baby's only 11 months old, they don't know it's electrical, and they don't know it's attached to something that can break. And you can yell and scream and get mad, but the child won't get the idea because they've got little pull toys that you tell them, and they can't tell the difference. So you don't get mad at a child for something they don't yet understand.
These steps sound like a lot that's going on. How does that affect brain development?
Well, each of those affects different parts of the brain. But like when you celebrate, there's a whole lot of neurochemistry that gets changed when you feel happy. When someone says, wow, you were the best moderator for this panel, there's going to be some things happening in your brain, and it's going to make you want to get in that situation again. You're going to want to come back and moderate even more panels because people love the job you're doing. And so there are a lot of things that happen with language. We know if children don't hear certain sounds, or perhaps if they don't make certain sounds when they're really little, it's very difficult to acquire them later. It's not that it's all over or impossible, but you've really missed an important window of opportunity for brain development.
Talk a little bit more about rich language development, because that seems like the most important step that we can take in schools and at home.
Well, again, a lot of children, I was hearing Todd Risley say, well, these families that just don't talk. There are those families, but we have seen a few families that don't realize the importance of talking to the little ones, so it's more a grown-up level of conversation. And the children are being more neglected before they're talkers. And I think some parents don't realize that children's comprehension or understanding is much more advanced than their ability to say words. And so the rich language is really engaging the child. I mean, sometimes it's parentese, sometimes it's silly kind of behavior. If a child makes a gurgly sound, you can go mimic the child, and then the child might mimic what you're doing. And you can play games with sounds, and it doesn't even have to be words or a conversation, in which, again, they're understanding that sounds coming from me cause a response from the world. The world pays attention to me when I make noise and when I say words. Wow. And so you'll see a lot of young parents now saying to a little child, use your words. So instead of a child just pointing like, I want that, they'll say, I want an apple. And you say, oh, you want an apple? Then I'll get you an apple. And then you begin to talk about the apple and give the discourse and help the child learn. And so that's what the rich language is all about.
Now, of the 7 elements, I called them steps earlier, but they're really elements. Of the 7 elements, guiding and limiting behavior is one that our audience might have a bit of a time understanding how that's going to help language development.
Well, if a child were not to tune in and pay attention, you might miss things in certain settings. I mean, there's a time, again, with socialization. And I think the main reason that being a well-socialized, not a perfect kid, I mean, you want kids to have fun. We're not talking about conforming or restricting a child, but learning, you know, there's different rules when you go to some places than at other places. When you're on the playground, you can use a different kind of voice and level of speaking than when you're in a place that's supposed to be quiet, like a movie theater or church or temple.
So it's a refinement of language?
It's a refinement, but a child who's perceived to understand that he or she belongs to lots of groups and to a community is a child that other people are going to want to spend time with. And if the child has people spending time with him or her, that's when they learn.
Almost all children have learned to speak with ease by age 3, but there are some children that haven't, and they have great difficulty. Why is that?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. I mean, there are children with special needs that can contribute, and specialists need to be involved in that. Kids can, of course, have hearing problems and speech production. But in our own research, we find that children who are lagging in their speech development, almost always, it's been a lack of experience. They haven't had enough people talk to them in ways to build that vocabulary to keep pace with children their age. So very often it's lack of the right kinds of experiences.
Dr. Washington, how does that track with your experience?
I think that's true when we're talking about children who are typically developing. When we're talking about children who have language impairments or who are not developing language like their peers, we find that more than half those children will have reading problems later. Reading and writing are really language on paper. And so a child who has a good oral foundation will often make the transition to reading much more easily than a child who has speech or language problems that are impeding their movement toward relating to text in a different way. And so those skills are really important. When I listen to Sharon talk about all the things that we're teaching children when they're young, it's like money in the bank. You are saving for later. Children are learning a lot about language now, but the foundation that you lay when you're 3 or 4 years old is the foundation that you build on as you are getting older and you're 5 or 6 years old. When that foundation is weak or non-existent, then it doesn't give teachers a whole lot to work with, and we have to think about a different starting point for those kids, that we need to back up, think about where we're starting with a child. That's that notion of individualizing, thinking about where a child is and moving forward. But children who really are having trouble developing language very often have difficulty learning to read and write.
Dr. Ramey, are children who are naturally more verbal going to develop better oral language skills?
There's certainly a tendency, because children who are more verbal will receive from others more verbal input. So a child who's talkative is inviting to adults to engage in conversation. But there are some children who are shy and kind of quiet, who are absorbing a great deal. I mean, children are like sponges, and they certainly can be building that foundation to be successful readers, to be bright, accomplished children. So talkativeness it's useful, but there are other ways of getting to a good end of being a great student and a good social partner that are not quite so talkative.
What about reading to a child? How does that affect their language development?
Well, again, reading, again, and I say, you know, for the little babies, reading is a great thing for grown-ups because it's a book and it reminds you about a lot. It's an excuse for a conversation. In my era, I don't think parents read to babies, But my parents told stories and they sang songs and, they did nursery rhymes all the time. And so it's the oral language environment, and books are part of it. And then when you read to young children, they learn concepts of print, how to turn the page. They learn that books are filled with fun and adventure, and that they're pretty, and that they can be touched, and all these wonderful books that have things you can manipulate. And so they can get turned on to books, but books are really integrated with the oral language tradition.
Thank you. That's a lot for us to think about. Here's a Head Start classroom in New York. Let's see how teachers there used books to stimulate children's language.
Ring around the rosy.
Many of these 3- and 4-year-olds are at risk for reading failure. They come from poor families, and poverty is clearly linked to low reading achievement. But they're being given a great boost in this Long Island Head Start classroom. Teacher Grace Wilson will use a new method of reading aloud, which increases vocabulary. Devised by Dr. Russ Whitehurst, the technique is called dialogic reading.
Dialogic reading is a type of shared book reading that is different in some respects from book reading as you would normally be exposed to. Dialogic reading involves much more frequent verbal interactions, tends to place the child more in the role of the teller of the story, and the adult in the role of the listener, the person who listens to the child, who responds to what the child says, who prompts the child to say more.
The classes here are small, a key prescription of dialogic reading. This allows Ms. Wilson to direct questions to every child. The simplest questions are who, what, when, how many.
Anisha, what color are the flowers?
White.
There was very little grass in the valley, and the billy goats were so hungry. First, the youngest billy goat, Gruff.
Miss Wilson uses a completion prompt, a straightforward fill-in-the-blank.
Roar the mean old
Troll.
And he was very
Mean.
and very
Ugly.
You're right. Ronald, show me something that really looks ugly on this troll. Oh, what is that?
Hair.
It's very ugly. You're right.
As kids get older, dialogic reading challenges them to connect the story with outside-the-class experiences. Ms. Wilson draws out these links with queries called distancing questions.
When was it that we touched a goat? 2 weeks ago, we were at the Holtzville Ecology Site, and they got to see goats. So that should be add to their input, and hopefully they'll remember that they saw goats there.
Dialogic reading was designed to help kids who were slow in developing spoken language. But this simple technique turns out to help all children.
This procedure, which is fairly easy to teach, but not something that everyone thinks of doing, has a lot of payoff. It's been shown to actually benefit children's listening comprehension and their vocabulary development.
With the new tool of dialogic reading, Ms. Wilson is helping her Head Start classroom live up to its name.
So, snip, snap, snout. This tale's told out. And what do we say at the end of the story, boys? Excellent.
Dr. Washington, children are often identified for speech-language services in Head Start. What types of problems do you generally see?
If a child, typically when children have speech and language problems and they're enrolled in Head Start, we're talking about children who have mild to moderate speech or language problems. And we make a distinction between speech and language. Speech is difficulty with the sound system. And so we're talking about children who misarticulate, so, those children who might hear say thumb instead of thumb. We're talking about children who have fluency problems, often called stuttering. Those are speech problems. Language problems are the vocabulary issues. They're putting words together to make meaning, so difficulty with sentences, difficulty producing and comprehending language are what we're talking about with preschoolers. And those tend to be the kinds of difficulty that we see in preschool classrooms.
I see. How do you distinguish between the mistakes of a child who's experimenting with and still learning language and the mistakes of a child who has a language problem?
they really are qualitatively different. They look different. So for example, if we're talking about a speech problem, a child who is 4 years old will be saying wabbit instead of rabbit often, and that is typical. But if you have a child who's 3 or 4 years old and unintelligible to a familiar listener, that is not typical. And we're not talking about your parents being able to understand you, because they can. But if the people at the bus stop have no idea what you're saying, then we're talking about something atypical. And in the case of children who are learning to put words together to make meaning, we have some benchmarks that we see at that early age. If you have a 2-year-old, they should be putting 2 words together. Mommy up. If they're 3 years old, 3 words. Mommy up, peace. And so, and on, and that works until kids are about 5 years old and they start doing things that are more complex. And then that 2 words at 2 years old, 3 words at 3 years old, 4 words at 4 years old, after a while doesn't work anymore, but it's a good benchmark for when they're very young. And so those are the kinds of things we're looking for. One of the things that we commonly see parents very concerned about is what they call stuttering, and what we know to be normal disfluency. At the time that a child is making the transition from using very simple sentences to using sentences that are more complex, we see them doing something that looks like stuttering, and it's called normal disfluency. So what your mother would say is their mouth can't keep up with their brain. And that's not a very scientific description, but it's absolutely true. And so we consider that progress. And those kids look different from children who really are going to stutter. Often with those kids, you'll see tension in their necks, you'll see behaviors like blinking, and you'll see that it's really hard for them to get the words out. In the case of the child for whom it's just normal, it's the, I'm really excited, I really want to tell you something, and I'm having trouble getting it out. And we ask that adults be patient. And it's that idea that Sharon was talking about earlier, that we don't want to call negative attention to it, make the child feel like something's wrong with it, because we don't want it to develop into something that's not normal. But it is absolutely normal. So there are some real qualitative differences in the way that children who are having difficulty develop language and those who aren't. And if you're a parent who's concerned, your concern is enough, and you should bring it up with your teacher or your pediatrician or another professional.
Dr. Risley, Dr. Washington just talked about your concern is enough. That seems like a lot for a parent to know. In your experience with parents, do they know the difference?
Yes. For most parents, remember they're talking, you know, from my experiences with babies and toddlers, they're not as concerned with content at that age. Mm-hmm. But the real differences are in talkativeness, in interchange, and dancing with words. We can mislead parents by saying, well, you need to talk to your baby. And what do? Well, they start asking questions. They start quizzing the baby. And so that's not what it is. It's like what we see parents doing who are talkative, they give vocabulary to children, are just parallel talk thinking aloud. I'm going to turn left at this next corner. I think I'm looking for the peas where in the shopping mall. It's commentary about things. It's commenting on what the child is doing, describing and labeling things that you see, commenting on what you're doing, commenting on what's going on around you. That's the input side. That's the side that gives you a rich vocabulary. It's that kind of amount in meaning, in context. The child side of it is we just teach parents to comment and pause. You say something and you wait. You say something and you wait. Children love to take their turns. You know, so they step right in as long as you give them a space. So you're kind of commenting and wait. So comment and wait. And they begin then to take their turn in the dance. And that's where the interchange and the conversation and the discussion, that's where the richness happens, is the interchange between parent and child, multiple turns.
One of the neat things about children is when they have good experiences, they take those to other places. So if you have a child in a great child care setting, a great preschool or great Head Start program where the teachers pay a lot of attention and do lots of talking back and forth, that child will go home and bring out the best from his or her parents. And the child can get the parents to be more talkative. And the same is true for parents who talk a lot at home. That child will go into a school setting and get people to talk to the child so the child can keep on learning.
Becomes very much an interaction, doesn't it?
It is. The children are, and this is from scientific research that shows the children can change the adults.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Washington and the rest of the panel. Now we have a clip of Dr. Washington at work from her days at the University of Michigan.
Brianna Hargrove was waving a red flag for reading problems at 8 months old. That's when her mother found out Brianna was hearing impaired.
Brianna was born prematurely, so they took a hearing test at birth, and she passed the test. So we did a follow-up when she was about 8 or 9 months, and that's when I found out that she had a hearing loss.
From the moment they're born, our kids send us signals about how hard reading may be for them. In the way they speak, the way they listen, the way they respond to us. It's our job as parents to watch for warning signs, like these.
Speech and hearing impairments are of critical concern when children are learning to read because, of course, we teach reading using sound.
Carlotta Gore is meeting with Dr. Julie Washington, a researcher at the University of Michigan.
Will she read easily? No. It's going to be work. It's going to be work for you, it's going to be work for her, and it's going to require the cooperation of a lot of professionals.
Carlotta got help for Brianna right away. The decision was tough, but she decided that Brianna would have surgery to receive a cochlear hearing implant. Then, she took advantage of every available early learning opportunity, from Head Start to summer programs at the university. And she's watched Brianna carefully for problems.
There are a number of possible signs as a child is entering kindergarten that may signal that they're going to have some difficulty in reading. A child who comes to school with a poor vocabulary, who doesn't really seem to comprehend directions, a child who can't follow the classroom routine, a child who doesn't seem to be able to interact with peers. Those are all signs that a child may have difficulty.
If Brianna has difficulty learning her numbers, her letters, and her sounds, or with rhyming, Carlotta would be right to be concerned.
Children who are having difficulty in kindergarten are very likely to still be having difficulty in 3rd grade. So that indicators like being able to recognize all the letters of the alphabet is a strong predictor of reading ability. And so if you have a child who knows half of the letters at the end of kindergarten, I don't think that the appropriate response is he'll learn the other 13 in 1st grade. That's one of those red flags, that a child who is having difficulty even identifying the letters will be a child who is going to have difficulty with the next level.
As a child moves up into 1st and 2nd grade, there are some new things to watch for.
You start seeing some trouble with some of those kids with remembering things that they've learned. And so every time we sit down, it seems like we've never done this before. That's a real red flag, that you have a child who is having difficulty learning. And that child, almost 100% of the time, is going to have trouble with reading.
Once your child's class begins reading, watch carefully. Is your child in the lowest reading group? Does he hate to read aloud? Does he struggle to sound out words? These are all signs that your child might have a real problem learning to read. But how worried should a mom or dad really be when their 6 or 7-year-old is a little behind? What's the big deal?
Early intervention is key. We don't want parents to think that if your child is identified at 9 or 10, that they're doomed, because they're not. There's a lot that we can do at those ages, but the job of the professional, the parent, and the child is made easier by early intervention.
So we know, Dr. Washington, that a speech-language deficit in early childhood can lead to a reading problem later on. But what's the connection between speaking and reading?
If you think about what children know in terms, or what they're able to do in terms of oral language by the time they come to the reading process, an awful lot of what we will teach with reading depends upon them having those skills. So for example, when we're teaching the child to break that early code, to make the sound symbol correspondences, we have to have some, the child has to have some knowledge of the sound system, have a good knowledge of the sound system, so that a child who is having difficulty producing sounds is going to have a lot of difficulty with phonological awareness, because that difficulty with production often affects perception as well. So if you pronounce the TH with an F, do you hear it that way? Sometimes you do. and that perception is going to affect your ability to learn those sound symbol correspondences. That's the sound system. When we're talking about language and vocabulary, vocabulary is something we talk about a lot because the vocabulary that a child brings to the reading process through their oral language skills will really impact how well they do with reading. If you've ever watched a young child learn to read, you see them start with the trying to sound it out. I know the sounds and I say the word, and when I do it, it's the wrong word. Then you watch the child go through that mental dictionary and match what's in their head in that dictionary to what they see on the page. If the dictionary is deficient, we may never get to the word on the page. And so each one of those skills that a child brings from oral language to the reading process supports the reading process. It provides the foundation. And so the things that Dr. Risley's talking about as they relate to children being talkers and coming to school with a lot of words, with a lot of world knowledge, with a lot of concepts, are the building blocks upon which reading will be developed. And in the absence of those building blocks, the process is not impossible, but it's a lot harder.
Well, on the clip you talked about children not being doomed at 9 or 10.
That's
but
right.
Is there a critical period for language development, or the development of language, I guess? And also, should parents be worried if their child is a late talker?
That's the age-old question that everybody disagrees on, and we're starting to learn a whole lot more about. Research in speech and language shows that about 70% of late talkers will catch up, and so they'll be fine. And that's great if your child is in that 70%. If they're in the 30% that doesn't, then as a parent, you should be very concerned, because those children are the children that we're really seeing having delays. It's not clear to us yet, though, who's going to be, which of the children in that 100% are going to be in the 70% that catch up. And even among late talkers who do start talking and do look like they're doing well, we're starting to see some evidence that later they're having some difficulty with language and social kinds of language issues. And so we really want to pay attention to late talking. Every speech pathologist has a horror story about a pediatrician who has a child, tells a parent, he'll talk when he gets ready. Or my uncle didn't talk till he was 5 and now he's a doctor. Well, you know, his uncle is the exception. He's not the rule. And so we see parents who bring kids to us who are 4 or 5 years old who aren't talking yet, and yet we're also talking about the age at which we're starting to teach those children to read. And if you think about what I said earlier, that language is the foundation for reading, a child who's not talking until they're 3 or 4 years old and is in school where they're now starting to try to teach them to read is going to be at a tremendous disadvantage. And so late talking is something we should pay attention to.
So what is the role of a speech language pathologist in helping children learn to read?
Speech pathologists are just starting to, I think, really understand the role that we play. There was a landmark study in 1998 that talked about reading as a language process. That reading is language. And so the people who specialize in language are the people who are going to have the most expertise in terms of being involved in the reading process. For us as professionals, we've spent a lot of time over the last few years working on articulation and using that sort of old model of pulling kids out, working on their speech and language problems, and not being as involved in the classroom with the reading process as we should be. And we're now starting to kind of redefine the way that we interact with teachers in the classroom. So we're not just there for the special education child who isn't learning to read, but we're there for the general education child who's now trying to take these oral language skills and turn them into reading. And so the speech pathologist can be a real support in the classroom, working on vocabulary building activities, working on book reading. In our own research, the interventionists in the classroom are speech language pathologists. They're in the classroom working with teachers, intervening, trying to help them learn to use the dialogic book reading process we talked about earlier, to pay attention to children's language age instead of just their chronological age.
So you probably are saying then that there are some speech pathologists that have a greater role than others in our public schools.
That's right. And it is my hope that speech pathologists will have an even greater role in the future, that general educators and speech pathologists and the psychologists in the school systems will learn to work together in the reading process for children who are at high risk, for children who are developing language normally, and for children who are developing reading normally, and for children who are having problems, that we become more of an integrated part of the reading process instead of just the people you go to if you have problems. We can be the language specialists, not just the special ed specialists.
A whole new role.
Yes, it is. It's a paradigm shift.
As promised earlier in the show, we now have parents and teachers and other professionals in our studio audience who want to ask questions of our panel.
What's the greatest barrier you see to implementing strong, effective early childhood education that promotes literacy skills?
Dr. Ramey, you want to take that?
I would like to take that. I think we still need to get the message to everybody about how important early learning is, and that learning is not stressful for young children. I think sometimes people have tried to take a first grade classroom and give it to 3-year-olds, and it's atrocious. And parents are saying, oh, we're expecting too much of our little ones. Let them be little, let them play. Well, they can play and have fun at the same time that they build this phenomenally strong foundation for school success. So I think it's a little bit low expectations and sometimes a misunderstanding about what learning means, because many of us, unfortunately, and hopefully what will be called bygone generations, had teachers who didn't know what today we know from science. So I think we need to get the message out that early learning is fun and kids are ready for it.
That's right.
Great. We have another question.
I have a major concern about the widening gap between African American students and non-minorities, particularly in reading. Why does the gap exist, and what can we do to lessen it?
That's the million-dollar question. I don't know if the gap is widening as much as it's not closing. And I don't know that it matters that that's the case. But it has been stubborn. It has been around for a long time, for much longer than we've documented, I'm sure. And we haven't had much success in closing it. I do believe that it's a multifaceted issue. It's some of the issues that Sharon was talking about as well, and those issues are expectations, expecting that those children will learn and that they'll learn to read. Some of the cultural differences that children bring to school and trying to integrate them into how we're teaching children. I also think that one of the major things that we talk about that I do think we have to be concerned about are the kinds of things that Todd found in his study, and there's this inequality that happens long before children get to school. The achievement gap does not happen after kids get to school. It's present from the very beginning. The Department of Ed did a study a few years back and showed that the achievement gap was present at kindergarten. And the reality is it was present at kindergarten because that's the age they tested. If it had been preschoolers they tested, it would have been present at that time. It would have been present at toddlerhood. It would have been present at infancy. And so a lot of the kinds of things that we're talking about, from babbling to books, we need to be concerned about not waiting until kids show up in school and really go back to babbling and start from the beginning trying to close that gap. Because once kids get to school, it's not impossible, but it is an uphill battle.
I want to say a good news thing that we hear about the gap, and I think some people think that the children who aren't performing as well aren't learning, but that's not true.
They are
There's
learning.
a landmark study in Baltimore that showed the children who came from more challenged and low resource homes actually learn more during the school year if they get good teachers. So it's not an inability to make progress. And then what happens is in the summer, for families with low resources, where families are working 2 and 3 jobs, parents have chronic health problems and fatigue, in the summer, those children don't lose their skills, but they slow down.
That's right.
And the children from the high resource homes keep on learning at the same rate. And that's why the gap gets bigger every year. We need year-round learning opportunities.
There's so much more to talk about there. The gap is so important.
We could talk about this the whole show.
We could.
That's
We
right.
certainly could.
This is the whole show.
Let's go to the next question.
When working with children who come from multilingual homes, if the child seems to have developed a speech delay or stuttering, should the parents just try to focus on communicating most with the primary language?
It's a good question. And some of the things that I was saying earlier apply about normal disfluency and about speech issues. When children are learning two languages, often we see a period where the kids kind of slow down. And if the parents don't freak out at that time, at the end of that slowdown, you're going to have a bilingual child. It's a natural part of the bilingual learning process that you will see children slow down, become listeners and observers of language, and then take off. We talk about children as being limited information processors. If you have a child who's 2 who is learning to ride a tricycle, they're not going to be learning new vocabulary because all of our effort is going into moving those legs and getting that tricycle moving. And once we get those motor skills kind of under control and we've learned this, then we see these spurts in language. The same happens for children who are learning 2 languages. And so we see that those kids slow down some and then they become bilingual. Should the parents speak to their children in their primary language? My personal bias is that whatever your best language is the one that you should be using with the child. If you're learning English and don't speak it well, but you speak Spanish well, speak Spanish because you are your child's language model and you want to model good language skills.
Don't we wish we had all day to talk about
That's
this?
right. That's
Dr.
another
Risley,
one of those all day topics.
I want to get this last question to you.
There's a lot of good information being discussed here today. How do we get it out to the parents who need it the most?
Well, that's again a big issue. The first thing we do is not confuse parents too much with lots of complexity. With babies, the message is very clear and we can address it. We know we can get parents talking more. We know we can get them. We know we can, we've done that many times. We've done it, made parents talkers, as long as they're not hesitant about what they're doing. It's like speak in your native language. It's the parent side of the dance. They're the best dancer in their native language. Use it. But the message is kind of clear for babies is talk to your babies, interact with your babies a lot. That's, and it's not a complex message. It's hard to do because parents who don't talk have grown up in families who don't talk, and so they've never seen people talking. So we need lots of examples, we need lots of, but the message is clear and simple.
So much more for all of us adults to learn so our children can learn. Thank you, everyone. If you'd like more information about this topic, please go to readingrockets.org and click on teleconferences and webcasts. And while you're there, please fill out our teleconference survey. We'd love to know what you think. You can watch this program and other shows in our Reading Rockets webcast series online at www.readingrockets.org. Thank you for joining us.
The Reading Rockets teleconference series is a production of WETA. This program is made possible by the generous support of Scholastic, the world's largest publisher and distributor of children's books and a leader in educational technology. Major funding for Reading Rockets comes from the United States Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. Our partners for this program include the American Speech Language Hearing Association, the National Head Start Association, Parents Action for Children, and the National Association of State Directors of Special Education.